reading from the letter to the Hebrews. Brothers and sisters, God is not unjust so as to overlook your work and the love you have demonstrated for his name by having served and continuing to serve the holy ones. We earnestly desire each of you to demonstrate the same eagerness for the fulfillment of hope until the end, so that you may not become sluggish, but imitators of those who, through faith and patience, are inheriting the promises. When God made the promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself and said, I will indeed bless you and multiply you. And so, after patient waiting, Abraham obtained the promise. Now, men swear by someone greater than themselves. For them, an oath serves as a guarantee and puts an end to all argument. So when God wanted to give the heirs of his promise an even clearer demonstration of the immutability of his purpose, he intervened with an oath, so that by two immutable things, in which it was impossible for God to lie, we who have taken refuge might be strongly encouraged to hold fast and to hope that lies before us. This we have as an anchor of the soul, sure and firm, which reaches into the interior behind the veil, where Jesus has entered on our behalf as forerunner, becoming high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Verbum Domini. The Lord will remember his covenant forever. I will give thanks to the Lord with all my heart, in the company and assembly of the just. Great are the works of the Lord, exquisite in all their delights. He has won renown for his wondrous deeds. Gracious and merciful is the Lord. He has given food to those who fear him. He will forever be mindful of his covenant. He has sent deliverance to his people. He has ratified his covenant forever. Holy and awesome is his name. His praise endures forever.
Sancti Evangelii secundum Marcum.
Gloria tibi, Domine.
As Jesus was passing through a field of grain on the Sabbath, his disciples began to make a path while picking the heads of grain. At this the Pharisee said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and he and his companions were hungry? How he went into the house of God when Abiathar was high priest, and ate the bread of offering that only the priest could lawfully eat, and shared it with his companions. Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That is why the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Verbum Domini. Today we observe the memorial of Saint Anthony of the Desert, who is considered the father of monasticism. And he is, I have to make this link to the great Franciscan Saint Anthony of Padua, for there is a connection. Saint Anthony of the Desert lived in the 3rd century, so, in the 200s. But yesterday's feast day and today's feast day point to St. Anthony of Padua. And I'm not speaking well of St. Anthony of Padua just because he happens to be my patron, but because of he's such a popular saint in the church, the most popular male saint. Yesterday, the Franciscan family observed the memorial of St. Berard and companions, and they were the first martyrs of the Franciscan community, the Franciscan family. And they were 5 holy friars who were going on their way to Morocco to preach to the Mohammedans, to convert the Muslims, and to bring the message of Christianity to them. And as they were on their way, they passed through Portugal and stopped at the Augustinian monastery where St. Anthony was living in Coimbra, Portugal. And so he met these 5, there were 6 of them, one of them got sick along the way, but he met these 5 holy men, and he was impressed by their zeal. And then he saw them go off on their mission. Well, these 5 men, 5 Franciscan friars, were put to death, and their remains were brought back through Portugal on the way back to Italy, and their remains were brought to the chapel again at this monastery where St. Anthony was living as a young scholar, a young priest. And he prayed before their relics. He knew that they were saints, that they had died as martyrs. And so moved by their witness was he that he wanted to imitate them, to go and preach also the reality of Jesus Christ as our Redeemer, as our Savior to the Muslim people. That he went down the road, he left his Augustinian community and went down the road to this little tiny house where the early Franciscan friars were living in that community. And that little friary was named after St. Anthony of the Desert, this father of monasticism. And so as Fernando, as he was known at the time, became a follower of St. Francis, a follower of Jesus through the example of St. Francis, I would say, he took the name of Anthony of the Desert, was named after the patron of that little Franciscan friary. And as you know, because I know that you all are such great devotees of St. Anthony of Padua, that you know he went off on his way to go and preach to the Muslims, and the Lord had a different design. Put wind in the sails of the ship through a storm, and he never made it to his destination. He was a martyr of desire, but never gave his life as a martyr. Instead, he was a great preacher. So that's the connection. I was told by Father Joseph before Mass that our choir master pulled out all the stops in honor of the great patron of Father Anthony, But you didn't get it quite right, Derek, almost. But, there is the connection. That's what I wanted to point out today. But this wonderful saint, St. Anthony of the Desert, the father of monasticism, in whom our choir is singing in such great honor today. It was awesome. I felt, like sitting upon a throne coming in the procession today in his honor. And so, as I said, we call him the father of monasticism, and he went out into the desert in Egypt to live his life. He was, as a young man, he wasn't much older than Francis or John Paul, our altar boys, when his parents both died. And it was him and his sister that remained. And he inherited a large piece of property and great wealth. That's a temptation for some young man that age. But in church, he heard the gospel passage read about the rich young man, where Jesus said to him, "You go sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and then come follow me." And so, as many saints in that time did, and as we are to do the same today, we listen to the command of Christ. And this is our means of perfection, and this is what Anthony did, is that he went and gave his properties, the properties that he had inherited, to his neighbors, and he gave away his wealth to the poor, and he kept just enough to care for himself and his sister. And so as he lived on a little ways, he heard again in the scriptures the command of the Lord that we're not to worry about tomorrow. And so he took his sister and entrusted them to the care of a household, a group of maidens. And that's one of the earliest references to the concept of a convent. So they believe that he entrusted his sister to the care of these religious women. Now, John Paul, I see that your sisters are here, and I'm sure many days you would love to entrust them to the care of religious women and go on your way. But he did this not to get rid of her, but, out of love for her and care for her, because he was feeling this call. He had witnessed and heard about this man who had lived on the edge of their town a very simple, humble life. And so he wanted to do the same thing and imitate the way this person was living, a life of union with God. And we're told that anytime he would hear about these individuals who are living kind of this life of penance or a life of asceticism, he would seek them out and ask them questions to learn more about how they live this way of life. And so this is how he began to develop the way of life that he was observing. And we hear this in this era, and even as religious life kept developing, they wouldn't live in the midst of the people, but they didn't live too far away from them either. They were on the edge of town where people could find them. And there was a twofold reason for that. One was that they weren't far enough away from civilization that they were forgotten, but that people could provide some basic means for them. And people would bring bread to Anthony, and this is what he lived off of in a life of penance, often eating bread and water, and sometimes a few dates, but also that people could find them. And isn't this what we do today, that in the busyness of our life, we often look at the monastery on the edge of town, and we go there because it's a place of prayer and a place of solitude and a place to grow in wisdom. Many times we consult when we have an issue. This happens so often to cloistered nuns. I'm always amazed at cloistered nuns who their whole vocation is to be hidden from the world, that they set their life aside to live apart from us. And yet they always know before everybody else what's going on in people's lives. You know, you'll say, oh, so-and-so's father died. And the sisters can say, oh yes, he's been sick for a long time. And you wonder, how do you know that? You know, you have this cloister wall, and how did you know he was sick all that time? And they're not there for the sake of gossip, but they're there often because people come to them and ask for prayer. And how often has it been your experience when you've met these sisters or religious men, an even group of monks, that when you ask them for prayers, you're also asking them many times for counsel. You know, oh sister, oh father, my son, my daughter is just at my wit's end, you know. And this holy person tells you, gives you a word of encouragement, a word of counsel, and something to give you peace in your heart. Before you kill your child, give him another opportunity. You know, it might be as simple as that. And you do. You put the gun down, you lay the knife down, and you give your child another chance. And you say, look, the Lord has led him around to the right path, you know. And it is through the prayers of these holy people. And this is what happened with Anthony, is that these people of the local community would ask him for words of insight and wisdom and ask for his prayers. We know that as he kept getting older, he went out off to this mountain and lived a life of solitude and prayer. And then other people wanted to begin to imitate his way of life. And so he came and established his way of life in the desert, and these other men gathered around him. And that was the beginnings of what today looks to us like a monastery. They had all these little hermitages, and they followed a manner of life that was based on his teaching or on his words. And we know the most about his life because of the account given by St. Athanasius. Now, St. Anthony would leave at times because he was revered, and so when there was trouble, they would ask him to come out of his solitude and speak. And on one of the occasions that he did that, it was during the time of the Arian heresy. And when he had first heard of this, the spread of this heresy, Anthony had a dream, and he saw this donkey kicking the altar in the church. And it really was offensive to him, and he realized as time went along that this was an image of this beginnings of this heresy, the Arian heresy. And anybody that would come to this desert area where he was, who espoused the Arian heresy, he would chase them away. He didn't even want them near him. And he'd call them venomous serpents and would cast them away. Can you imagine that today in our PC culture? Venomous serpents, you know, oh, how dare you? You know, I mean, everybody would be mortified. You know, but this is how he was so heartfelt in speaking against anything that was contrary to the Lord, denying Christ's divinity. So he was asked by the bishops to come and speak in Alexandria, and he was very eloquent and very effective in converting many people. But they wanted him to stay on longer. You know, once you see something good, it's like, why don't we keep it? It's working well, let's keep you here longer. And one of the teachings he gave at that moment was about his way of life. He said, as fish die if they are taken from the water, so does a monk wither away if he forsake his solitude. And so he recognized his need that, he came out of that for a purpose, but he needed, if he was going to persevere, he needed to have that life of solitude and silence. And we know that he would rise, he worked, did manual labor throughout the day, often weaving these mesh, these mats or these baskets. And at night that he would be in prayer, often rising around 3 o'clock in the morning and praying with his arms outstretched. And this is what monastic communities still do today, rising in the middle of the night for their vigils and times of prayer, and then having a little respite and being up, or again, very early in the morning, singing the praises of God in the Psalms. There's also an account that he had received a letter from Constantine the Great and his sons, and the emperor's asking him for counsel regarding his sons. Now the other monks, again, this is human nature. Imagine getting a letter from the president, or imagine receiving a letter from the queen. Just holding it in your hands, everybody would, it would just be, your eyes would open, and how important you must be. Because it's not just a letter, he's asking you for input, Can you imagine that today? I go walk outside and say, the president-elect has written me this letter, and he's asked me to give him counsel and direction. You all would be bowing down before me, saying, "Oh, Father, it's just wonderful." Well, this is what was happening with the monks around Anthony. They were wondering, what in the world was he going to respond? And he said, "Do not wonder that the emperor writes to us, a man even as I am. Rather be astounded that God should have written to us, and that he has spoken to us by his Son." And a beautiful way of speaking about the Scriptures, the reality of the incarnation, that God has written to us in sending us his Son, and the Word becoming flesh. And so that we listen to his teaching then in this inspired text, this inspired Word of God. This is only a saint could say something like that. Who cares if some worldly power contacts you? God wrote to us. And I think that's what we can take from St. Anthony as we reflect on his life today. A real radical detachment from the world, not to have a fear of having some form of penance in our life. We don't always like that, but to embrace the cross out of love for God. Our motivation has to be correct. That it's out of love for God that we make a sacrifice so that we can be more and more free from this world, so that we can live more and more in the next world. And then our whole life is fashioned after the teaching of Christ, to remember that God wrote to us in sending us his Word.